The Odyssey is a movie about regret, like many Christopher Nolan movies, actually. You see, time often plays a central theme in his movies, and one key aspect of regret is the loss of time. And I cannot stop thinking about how it was handled with this story. Now, say what you will about how you interpret Homer's Odyssey, but Christopher Nolan's interpretation is heavily inspired by his views on regret and the end of the Bronze Age, while also using Emily Wilson's translation of the original epic, notably the first complete published translation of the poem into English by a woman. So now let's talk about the significance of the movie and how regret plays a large role in the making of this film. But before I talk about that, I want to discuss the rampant misogyny and racism that surround this movie. The Odyssey is a work of historical fiction, with fantastical creatures, and takes place in Greece a long time ago. Many people have very hateful views of this film, and I'm going to stamp it out right here. I'm not going to allow any sort of hate for this movie. And if you're on board with that, then we can talk about the movie together. So let's actually analyze what the Odyssey was trying to say. So the general premise is that Odysseus is on his way back home after successfully winning the Trojan War. A war started because originally Helen of Troy fell in love with Paris of Troy. Now, Helen of Troy is seen as the most beautiful woman in the world and the wife of Menelaus. But she was married off to Menelaus at a very young age. This is not covered in the movie, but this is sort of the context of why this all happens. Since she was so young, she does end up falling in love with Paris of Troy. And now their relationship has two different interpretations. One being that she fell in love and willingly went off to Troy with him, and the other being that Paris abducted her and took her away to the city of Troy in a sort of kidnapping. Christopher Nolan takes the stance that Helen actually fell in love with Paris and fled on her own accord, which is why she is brutally scarred when we see her in the movie next to Menelaus, and which is why she expresses so much regret over what happened, because it is truly her choice that she left for her lover. And now that is the driving force on what regret means to these characters, especially with Odysseus. Now, throughout the movie, they're talking about Xenia, which is Zeus's law, where you have to be kind, you have to showcase a positive sense of hospitality to your guests and to anyone, because you don't know them and you don't know if they would be a god in disguise. But just like Helen of Troy, Odysseus decides that he's going to make a very fatal choice. And that is a choice to make the Trojan Horse. A downright spit in the face of Zeus, because the idea of hospitality has to be paramount. It has to be the number one thing that you hold in society in order for society to properly function and for society not to decline and go into depraved dark ages, which is kind of why the Bronze Age declines, because of Odysseus's inciting act. And I quite love this interpretation because it means a lot to me in the present day. So when Odysseus decides to spit in the face of Zeus's law and hide in the Trojan horse, effectively winning the Trojan War, it was purely out of his own cunning, which then turned into regret, because he spat in the face of the gods. He desecrated the idea of Athena, and now Athena haunts him throughout the entire movie, taking the form of the person that was brutally murdered, whose blood was on his hands. The entire city's blood was on his hands, simply because he decided to make a choice that would doom them forever. And now this is the exact idea of Oppenheimer, someone who decided to make the atomic bomb with the backing of the United States government and this whole pressure during that time. Odysseus is in the same boat. He is pressured by his king, and he's also pressured by the long wait for the Trojan War, and thus develops an idea that ultimately dooms humanity in the future. And the Odyssey has so many things about it that you can tell there's just so much to it, because when you talk about the Cyclops ends up being Poseidon's son. He doesn't talk to the Cyclops in this movie, but there is a form of regret there, because now he's just upset Poseidon, the king of the seas. And also, when his crew get cursed by Circe and turn into pigs, there's also the idea about free will, because Circe tells them that these men are pigs. They have desecrated Zeus's law. They live their life with no shame and no regret, and they are animals. They are terrible. And Odysseus takes this blame upon himself. He says, they are my men. But the idea is that they chose this option. Christopher Nolan places a heavy emphasis on free will. There is no fates guiding these men to do these depraved acts in the name of their king or in the name of their Captain Odysseus. They are choosing to do these depraved acts out of just pure desperation and greed and wrath. And that is something that Odysseus constantly sees with his men and with the entire Trojan War. He sees what he has unleashed upon the world as if it was an atomic bomb. And that regret guides him to the idea that he does not want to return home. This is not the normal interpretation where the gods are tricking him for defiling their image and just torturing him, perpetually not being able to get home. This is a conscious choice that Odysseus makes for himself. He wants to forget. That's why when he's with Calypso, he willingly eats the lotus flower to just rid his mind of all that grief and regret that he feels for this moment, for all that he has done. So Christopher Nolan's interpretation heavily relies on the man's free will. It is not a consequence necessarily of the gods, but his own choices that led him and the world towards a path towards the Dark Ages, the time where several written languages died out. And now this story will have to be told in song because there will no longer be writing. And something that Odysseus also remarks at the end of the film, that he just feels that his crimes that he has committed against humanity will be lost over time. And that is what this interpretation is. It is this story about regret, so much so that it affects the entire world and its collapse. And one of the prominent messages of this film is that the sea people, one who is often attributed to the decline in the Bronze Age, is when people would actually sail across ships and, raid and pillage other villages at behest of Zeus's law. Odysseus makes the conscious claim that he is part of the sea people. The sea people that everyone has been fearing is just him and his men, who have been doing depraved acts, who have been doing crimes all across the Mediterranean Sea. And that idea is the perfect representation of where we are headed as a society, which I'm sure Christopher Nolan has been subconsciously absorbing. This rise of anti-intellectualism is thrusting us into the Dark Ages, similar to how Odysseus feels at the end of the movie. His choices, his actions to unleash this sort of fire upon the world, whether you can relate that to modern day AI, modern day politics and policies, anything that you can see today that you believe is going to lead us down a darker path, we have set that up ourselves. In Oppenheimer, he's the one who regrets the atomic bomb, yet he is the one who made it. Odysseus regrets the decline of civilization into savagery, yet he was the one who became savage. Us as a civilization now are at a huge turning point because everything that we are developing, especially with technology, has the capability to thrust us into an age of anti-intellectualism, into hatred, into racism, into misogyny, into terrible times, and yet it is because of our own creation, of people in power who have chosen to create things for the idea of progress, and yet it will regress us back to a savager time with no scruples. And that is why I cannot stop thinking about this movie. There is so much to unpack with it. The initial regret of the Cyclops, how his men choose to eat the cattle on the island for Helios. Everything feels like it's Odysseus' fault and not a consequence of the gods. Everything relies solely on his shoulders, and it frames him as the initial villain. Because again, the Trojan Horse was the inciting incident that society will collapse based on how careless men choose to exercise their free will. And that is a great interpretation of the story. I quite resonate with that. I think it is such a fantastic story that is very prevalent today. And that's what all adaptations need to be. Because if you watched or listened to an adaptation, 100 years ago of the Odyssey, or watched the SpongeBob movie, or any other adaptation of it, it's going to be very prevalent for the time. It's going to be very prevalent for what they want to contain. So for example, with the SpongeBob movie, it's comedic. It's about growing up and becoming a man. And now, this movie is very prevalent with the times about making the wrong decisions that lead the whole world into chaos, which starts at his home. So that is the theme of the Odyssey, and that's how Christopher Nolan interprets this story to showcase with us all. And I feel like a lot of people are missing that key aspect. a lot of people are still so focused on what they had learned the Odyssey to mean. And now the Odyssey is such a dense story. They cut out a lot, but it's the idea that this story is so universal and has been passed down through thousands of years of history so that it still relates to us even now. The way that we see the story is vastly different than what we saw it back then. But now we can really apply it to our society now and learn from it and see how we move forward. Because also, let's be honest, the Odyssey is never the first story to ever exist. There is still the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the earliest one, and Odysseus is kind of related to Gilgamesh in that story, and there's a lot of overlap. And so everything gets interpreted in their own way, and I think regret is the #1 way to interpret it, where we are at the cusp of such an advanced age that might thrust us back into a position of savagery and an end to such a golden era. But that is how I interpreted Christopher Nolan's interpretation of the Odyssey, and I really want to hear what you all thought about it down in the comments. Do you agree with my take about it? Did you like the movie? Did you find it boring? Let me know your thoughts because I really want to hear them. And always, subscribe for more videos as I will be releasing these videos weekly for you all. Now there is also a lot to cover with the Odyssey that I did not touch upon everything, including the whole idea of him returning home and seeing his son grow up, because there is a regret for lost time there. And he comes back a entirely changed man, which feels as a theme of regret. And I really quite love this whole interpretation, and I love that scene where you see Zendaya killed at the Battle of the Trojan War. That is such a poignant scene, and that means so much because, beside the idea of regret, there's the idea of the killing of innocence. And the Cyclops is also portrayed as just an innocent creature who is harmed. And the dog of Odysseus is treated so terribly, that waited for his master, and it's just an innocent creature. There's so much to unravel with the story, and I think that's one of the things that really lets it be so present in modern day society, is there's so much to unpack with such a dense story that I could talk about this a lot, but I wanted to frame it, just this video, about the idea of regret, which I think is the primary driving force for this film. But hey, if you ever want to see me talk about this movie more, just let me know. Subscribe and let me know. And also, let me know if you enjoyed this video. Consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. As always, check the links in the description for my main video essay channel and my Patreon to support the channel and recommend media for me to review next. Thank you all to my current Patreon members who graciously donated to help keep this channel afloat. I am so grateful you are all here with me. But that is everything. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.